what we think of as feminism it's more like an iteration. It's like the iteration we've been in for some centuries of possibly the oldest question there is, which is how can men and women live together? Because we don't have exactly overlapping interests. There's, at least certainly when it comes to propagating the species, men and women don't exactly have overlap. Our interests overlap, but they don't exactly coincide. On the one hand, we're quite different physiologically. One half of the species gestates, and that makes you vulnerable, and then there are very small infants that are there to be taken care of, and historically that's generally been women who did that, although not necessarily always, and not in all places always. And on the other hand, men are physiologically bigger and stronger on average. And so, at different times and in different places, we've found ourselves dividing up the work that there is to do, which again varies depending on time and place and context. It might be a hunter-gatherer life, or it might be an agrarian life, or it might be a high-tech life like the one we have at the moment. But, in some form, if we're going to have a continuity and a functioning society, men and women have to divide the work up in a way that makes sense and allows for more humans to come into being and be nurtured, right? That's pretty fundamental. And my argument is that what we think of as feminism came into being specifically in the context of the industrial era, because the unique material conditions of the industrial era forced a far greater split between the lives of men and women than had previously been the case. Men went off to war in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, but in terms of households and in terms of ordinary people, farming people and artisans and so on, the division between men and women wasn't that huge because people worked together in households for the most part. You might have an extended family or one parents and their children working together in a house, and they might be growing food and making small items to sell, tending a small holding, looking after animals, and also caring for children. And women worked as well as men, on a cooperative enterprise, which involved the whole household. And economic production happened within the household for the most part. But what happened when the industrial era came along and work increasingly moved into factories and places of business was that the person who did the work and the person who tended the home, those spheres increasingly just didn't overlap at all. And what we think of as feminism begins to emerge in tandem with that process. My take on it is that what we think of as the sort of liberal and conservative positions on the role of women, the proper role of women, if you like, which is the sort of central terrain on which feminism is litigated even today, is two parallel strands for rationalizing that fundamental fact of how men and women have to live together in the industrial era. So on the one hand, the liberal feminists said, well, hang on, we're not sure about this being confined to the domestic sphere and being left in charge of children and the moral education and then the moral responsibility for human society, while men go off and get to do all the political stuff. Well, what about the women's vote? What about women in the workplace? What about all of that stuff? And the conservative response, which was pretty functional and more and fairly effective for some time, was what in the 19th century got called the cult of domesticity, the cult of the true woman. So this was the ideal homemaker who's the angel of the hearth, who sits at home and raises the children to be good, pure Christian, who's passive and pious, and not really a sexual being, but fundamentally is responsible for the higher moral virtues. And so, and plenty of women found that gave them, that felt like it gave them enough scope and agency to lead rewarding and fulfilling lives. And out of that came, whole sort of reform movements and temperance movements, and actually quite a lot of feminism. There's a whole conservative strand of feminism, which is perhaps underreported in the 19th century, or at least that reads as pretty conservative from a contemporary liberal feminist perspective, that was concerned fundamentally with moral regulation. But as time's gone on, things sort of evolve, within the terms of their own logic. And, as we've come into the 20th century and out of the 20th century into the 21st century, and the industrial era is increasingly feeling like it's in the rearview mirror. Certainly in the developed West, it's receding in the rearview mirror. my argument is that, in fact, the terms on which feminism, the terms on which we had the debate about how men and women should live together, which made sense if for the industrial era, which we call feminism, actually needs to be re-examined. The fundamental priors need to be re-examined because the conditions again are changing. We find ourselves confronted with technologies which have just dissolved the limits on what it's possible to do or be as a person, for example. People are talking about transplanting uteruses into people of the opposite sex, for example. The idea of what it is even to be a woman is fundamentally up for debate in a way which just would have been absurd 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. And my argument is that if we're going to make any sense of what's going on now, we can't be fighting the battles of the past. If we go on fighting about if we go on pursuing personal autonomy and fighting for women to be ever more liberated, quote unquote, from the home, from family, from our bodies, from our relationships, then we're going to be running headlong into the fourth industrial revolution. In a way which is not going to produce liberation for women at all. In fact, is already producing a nightmare. Mm-hmm. The potential direction of travel, I think, is deeply troubling. And the first thing, and I want to go right back to foundations and say, no, actually, feminism needs to take a stand against freedom and against progress, because actually freedom and progress have gone past the point of benefiting women and are now inimical to our interests, or at least of all except the very wealthiest women who still reap the benefits while they're still able to externalize the costs.